Welcome to Soothing Stories. Tonight, settle in and let the world outside grow quiet. This is a story about Alexander the Great. There is nothing you need to do now but listen and breathe. Let the words carry you gently into rest. The dust has not settled yet. It hangs in the air above the road like a second sky, amber and pink in the last light of the day, still moving in the slow currents left by 10,000 soldiers who passed this way an hour ago, their sandals and hooves and the iron wheels of supply carts, churning the dry earth of the Persian plain into something almost luminous. The sun is going down behind you, behind the west, behind everything you have already crossed, and the light it casts across this ancient land is the color of old bronze, of shields left out in the rain, of the skin of men who have walked under 100 different suns and been changed by every one of them. Ahead, the horizon is a long dark line, and above it the sky is turning through colors that have no names in Greek, a deep rose bleeding into violet, violet into a blue so concentrated it seems to contain within it the memory of every sky you have ever slept beneath. There are eagles up there, riding the last thermals of the day, banking in wide slow circles without a single wing beat, and below them the land stretches on, flat and enormous and indifferent, the way the earth is indifferent to the ambitions of those who pass across it. Tonight we follow one of the most extraordinary journeys in human history, the march of Alexander of Macedon, who left his small kingdom in northern Greece in the year 334 before the Common Era and did not stop walking east for 11 years, until his soldiers finally refused to go further, and the sea that he had called the edge of the world turned out to be only another beginning. He was 22 when he started. He was 32 when he stopped. In between, he crossed deserts and mountains and rivers no Greek had ever seen, fought battles that remade the map of the known world, and became, in his own lifetime and in the minds of every civilization that came after, something more and less than a man. Let the road open before you. Let the dust of that ancient passage settle around you like a memory. We are in no hurry tonight. There is only the road, and the fading light, and the immense, patient world through which it runs. To understand the march, you have to begin with Macedonia, a kingdom that the great city-states of Greece looked down upon with barely concealed contempt. Athens had its philosophy and its drama, Sparta its martial discipline and its austere pride, Corinth its commerce and its silver. Macedonia had mountains and horses and a king who spent his childhood as a hostage in Thebes and used that captivity to learn everything his captors knew. That king was Philip, Alexander's father, and he was one of the most formidable figures of the ancient world, a man who reorganized the Macedonian army, invented or refined the sarissa, the long pike that would become the signature weapon of Macedonian warfare, and spent 20 years methodically absorbing the quarrelsome city-states of Greece into his orbit. When Philip was murdered at a wedding feast in 336 before the Common Era, stabbed by one of his own bodyguards, for reasons that have never been entirely clear, his son was 20 years old and had already fought in battles, already shown the kind of physical courage and tactical intuition that men twice his age rarely possessed. Alexander took the throne before anyone could prevent him. Macedonia itself, the land Alexander grew up in, was a place of rugged beauty quite unlike the rocky, sun-bleached landscapes of southern Greece. The northern kingdom had forests of oak and beech and pine running across its mountain flanks, rivers cold enough in summer to numb your hand, a coastline that caught the northern light and threw it back as something grayer and cooler than the Mediterranean blue of Athens. The palace at Aegae, ancient capital of the Macedonian kings, now excavated at the site of modern Vergina in northern Greece, was a place of considerable sophistication, painted walls, mosaic floors, a theater where Philip was murdered during the wedding celebration, the whole thing surrounded by royal tombs packed with gold and silver graved goods of extraordinary quality. Alexander grew up in this world between the roughness of the Highland kingdom and the polish of a court that was making itself over in the image of Greece, and the tension between those two things, between the rough northern warrior and the Greek-educated philosopher prince, never entirely resolved in him. It ran through everything he did, the combination of physical recklessness and intellectual ambition that made him unlike anyone else the ancient world produced. The boy who became king had been educated by Aristotle. This is not a small thing. Aristotle, the student of Plato, the greatest systematic mind of the ancient world, had spent 3 years in the Macedonian court teaching Alexander rhetoric and philosophy and medicine and natural history, and the habits of thought that allow a person to look at something they have never seen before and understand it without being destroyed by it. Alexander is said to have slept with 2 things under his pillow, a dagger, and a copy of the Iliad annotated by Aristotle. The dagger for the obvious reasons. The Iliad because Alexander regarded Achilles, the great warrior of Homer's poem, who chose glory and early death over long life and obscurity, as his model, his mirror, the shape of the life he intended to live. He was, from the beginning, a person who understood himself through stories, and who intended to become one. He was also, from the beginning, something rarer than a general or a conqueror. He was genuinely, almost helplessly curious about the world. And the world was large. The lessons of Aristotle gave Alexander something that pure military training could not, a framework for encountering the unfamiliar. Aristotle had taught him that the natural world was ordered and legible, that careful observation of phenomena, of animals and plants and peoples and customs, could yield real knowledge, that the diversity of things was not chaos but a vast taxonomy waiting to be read. As Alexander moved east, he sent specimens back to Aristotle, seeds and plant cuttings, descriptions of animals, accounts of local customs and religious practices. The army that marched with him included not only soldiers but surveyors who measured distances and described terrain, scientists who collected botanical and zoological specimens, historians who recorded events. In this, Alexander's march was also a research expedition, the first large-scale attempt by a Greek mind to systematically observe and record the world beyond Greece. What they found out there often surprised them, and sometimes disturbed them, and occasionally filled them with a wonder that the ancient sources preserve even when they do not quite know what to make of it. The pretext for the Persian campaign was the old grievance, the invasions of Persia under Darius and Xerxes a century and a half earlier, the burning of Athens, the humiliation that the Greek world had never entirely forgotten. Alexander framed the invasion as revenge, as the punishment of a wrong long overdue. But the real motivation was harder to name. Curiosity, perhaps. The desire to see what lay beyond the edge of what anyone had mapped. The need to exceed his father, who had conquered Greece but never moved east. A genuine belief, nurtured by his education and his temperament, and the strange confidence that runs in some people like a river in flood, that he was capable of doing what no one had done, that the world yielded to those who insisted upon it. He crossed the Hellespont in the spring of 334 with an army of perhaps 37,000 men. He paused at the site of Troy to lay a wreath at the tomb of Achilles. And then he turned east. The first great battle was at the river Granicus, in what is now northwestern Turkey, in the spring of that first year. The Persian satraps, the governors of the western provinces, had assembled a force to stop him at the river crossing, positioning their cavalry on the far bank where the Macedonians would be most vulnerable, churning through the current. Alexander's generals counseled caution. Alexander did not practice caution. He led the cavalry charge himself, into the river, uphill toward the Persian line, wearing a helmet with white plumes that made him immediately visible and immediately targeted. He was nearly killed. A Persian nobleman split his helmet with a sword blow that glanced off his skull, and a second Persian was raising his weapon to finish the stroke when one of Alexander's companions cut him down. Alexander survived by inches, which is how he would survive the next 11 years. By inches, by fortune, by the kind of luck that attaches itself to people who are too confident to be cautious and too fast to be caught. The road south through what is now Turkey was lined with Greek cities, some of them centuries old, founded by Aegean colonists in the distant past, their citizens speaking Greek, building in Greek styles, worshipping Greek gods, and yet governed for generations by Persian satraps. As Alexander moved through them, many opened their gates. He was liberating, or so he said, and some of them believed it. Others were more skeptical but calculated that a man who had already destroyed the Persian cavalry at the Granicus was worth welcoming carefully. There is something about movement at this scale, 10,000 people moving through a landscape, that changes the landscape itself. The road from the Granicus south toward the heartland of Anatolia would have borne the marks of the army's passage for months afterward, the ruts of the supply wagons, the broad swaths of trampled grass on either side where the columns spread out in the heat, the ash of the cooking fires at every campsite, the dung of 10,000 horses and mules baked dry in the sun. The land absorbed it all, as land does. The ruts filled with winter rain, the grass grew back, the ash dissolved into the soil, and within a decade there would have been almost nothing left to show that the greatest army of its age had passed this way. Only in the cities they had besieged, the walls they had broken, the libraries and archives they had sometimes preserved and sometimes destroyed, did the permanent record remain. And in the stories. Always in the stories. He reached the city of Gordium, the ancient capital of Phrygia, and there he encountered the famous knot, the Gordian knot, a tangle of cornel bark so complex and tight that no one had ever found its ends, and the prophecy attached to it said that whoever untied it would rule Asia. Alexander looked at it for a moment, and then drew his sword and cut it in half. Or he pulled out the pin that held the yoke and the pole together, and the knot fell apart. The accounts differ. What is certain is that he left Gordium with the prophecy apparently fulfilled, and with no particular concern for the method. Let the dust of those Anatolian roads settle for a moment. The evening is coming on, and the air is cooling, and the landscape around you, if you imagine yourself there, in that ancient spring, is extraordinary. The rolling uplands of Anatolia, the plateau country, with its wide sky and its late wildflowers and the distant gleam of rivers in the fading light. Alexander's army moved through this landscape at a pace that astonished observers, 30, sometimes 40 kilometers in a day, the infantry keeping up with the discipline and physical conditioning that had been built into them by years of training under Philip and Alexander. They were not a rabble. They were the finest army the Greek world had ever produced, and they knew it, and there was in the way they moved, the dust they raised, the sound of their equipment, the organized violence of their passage, something that the people of the cities and villages along the road felt before they saw, a vibration in the earth that arrived ahead of the army like a message. Let your breathing slow. Let that image drift. The decisive confrontation with Persia came at Issus, in the autumn of 333, on the narrow coastal plain where the Anatolian plateau drops down to the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean. The Persian king Darius III was there in person, a tall, handsome man who had come to the throne after the previous king died under disputed circumstances, who was by all accounts personally brave but not a natural commander, who had made the tactical error of choosing to fight in the narrow coastal strip where his vastly larger army could not spread out and use its numbers. Alexander's tactics at Issus were characteristic. The Macedonian phalanx held the center with its forest of long pikes while Alexander himself led the companion cavalry, the elite horsemen who formed his strike force, in a diagonal charge toward the point in the Persian line where Darius himself was standing in his great war chariot. The charge worked. The Persian line broke around Darius. The king fled, abandoning his mother, his wife, and his children on the battlefield. Alexander captured them, and treated them with a formal courtesy that was probably genuine. He had been raised by Aristotle on the stories of the Persian wars, and even his enemies were the inheritors of a great civilization, and he knew it. After Issus, the Mediterranean coast opened before him. He moved south through what is now Lebanon and Israel and Palestine, taking the great Phoenician harbor cities one by one, some surrendering, some resisting. Tyre was the great resistance, an island city, its walls rising from the sea itself, its people confident that the water that surrounded them on all sides would protect them as it had always protected them. Alexander built a causeway. It took 7 months. He dragged stone and timber into the sea and pushed it toward the city and fought off the Tyrian ships and the Tyrian fire and the Tyrian ingenuity with a stubbornness that his troops must have found alternately inspiring and maddening, and in the summer of 332 he broke through the walls. He was not gentle with Tyre. The city that had defied him became an example. He continued south. Egypt received him like a god. The Persians had been unpopular rulers of Egypt. They had interfered with the temples, killed sacred animals, imposed their administration on a civilization that regarded itself as the oldest and most sacred on earth. And Alexander, who accepted the role of Pharaoh and performed the rituals that pharaohs performed and made the offerings to Ammonius that the priests required, was welcomed with a relief that felt, to the Egyptians, like the restoration of correct order. He visited the oracle of Ammonius at Siwa, deep in the Libyan desert, making a journey of considerable difficulty through trackless sand. What the oracle said to him there, in the inner sanctuary of the god, no one knows. He never repeated it, not even to his closest companions. He came out of the oracle's chamber changed, or so the people who knew him said, quieter, more certain, as though something that had been a question inside him had received its answer. He founded a city at the mouth of the Nile's western branch, and called it Alexandria, and then he turned back east. He had a world to finish crossing. The last great battle with Darius came at Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq, in the autumn of 331. Darius had chosen his ground carefully this time, a wide flat plain where his scythe chariots and war elephants could maneuver. He had leveled the ground himself. He had an army that outnumbered Alexander's several times over. The night before the battle, Alexander's general Parmenion suggested a night attack, to avoid the disadvantage in numbers. Alexander declined. He is said to have replied that he did not steal his victories. He went to his tent and slept so deeply and so long that in the morning his officers had to wake him, and he told them, when they asked how he could sleep on the night before such a battle, that he was relieved, now that Darius had stopped running and agreed to fight, the whole matter could be resolved. He was either the most confident man in the world or the most reckless, and in the event, the distinction did not matter. The battle went as the battles always went. The phalanx held, the cavalry charged, Darius fled again, and this time he did not stop running for very long. He was murdered by one of his own men a year later, in the mountains of what is now northern Iran, abandoned and alone. Alexander found the body and covered it with his own cloak. The Persian Empire was his now. Persepolis, the great ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid kings, the city that Xerxes had built and Darius had adorned with the tribute of the world, fell to Alexander in the winter of 331. He burned it. Whether this was a deliberate act of symbolic revenge for the burning of Athens, or the result of a drunken night with a courtesan named Thais who suggested it and lit the first torch, or something more complicated that has been simplified by the transmission of stories across centuries, the accounts disagree, and the truth of that night is gone. What remains is the archaeological fact of charred cedar and scorched limestone, and the image of the man standing in the courtyard of the palace of Darius as the flames rose, watching the greatest building in the known world burn, perhaps already thinking about what lay further east. Because there was always something further east. This is the thing about Alexander that no one who knew him could entirely explain: the inability to stop. He had Persia. He had Egypt. He had everything west of the Hindu Kush, more territory than any Greek had ever imagined controlling. And still there was East. There was always East. The philosophers he had read told him the world was finite, a disk or a sphere, bounded by a great ocean called the outer sea. If he kept walking east, he would reach it. He would stand at the edge of the world and look out at the water that bounded everything, and he would know he had gone as far as it was possible to go. This idea seems to have had a genuine grip on him, not merely the desire to conquer but the desire to know, to reach the limit, to see what the world was made of by walking all the way to its edge. He moved east. The Hindu Kush is not a gentle thing. The mountains that divide what is now Afghanistan from Pakistan rise to over 24,000 feet, and the passes through them in winter are places of genuine danger, narrow tracks across snowfields, altitude that thins the blood and dulls the mind, cold that kills men in their sleep. Alexander's army crossed the Hindu Kush twice. The first crossing, in the spring of 329, took them into the region the Greeks called Bactria, the flat, arid land north of the mountains, now divided between Afghanistan and the former Soviet republics of Central Asia. The second crossing, eastward, came later. What the soldiers thought as they looked up at those peaks, after years of marching, after the sun of Egypt and the heat of Mesopotamia and the long dry roads of Persia, no one recorded their thoughts with sufficient care. But the army was changing. Men had died of wounds and disease and exhaustion. New soldiers had joined, Persians and Medes and Bactrians incorporated into the ranks. The army that crossed the Hindu Kush eastward was not the same army that had crossed the Hellespont 7 years earlier. It was something new, something that had no name yet. Bactria brought a different kind of war. The great battles of the Western Campaign had been set-piece affairs. Two armies facing each other across a field, the outcome decided in hours. The Bactrian Campaign was a guerrilla war, fought across mountain and steppe against an enemy that did not stand and fight but melted away into the landscape and reappeared behind you. The Bactrian leader Bessus, who had murdered Darius and claimed the Persian throne for himself, was eventually captured and executed. But even after Bessus was gone, the fighting continued, a grinding, exhausting, 2-year struggle against a landscape as much as an enemy. It was in Bactria that Alexander made the decision that most alienated his Macedonian commanders. He began to adopt Persian court customs. He wore Persian robes on some occasions. He expected the proskynesis, the full prostration before the king that Persian subjects performed, from his non-Macedonian followers, and at times from all followers. He married a Bactrian princess named Roxanne, not a diplomatic marriage arranged by advisors, but apparently a genuine choice, made in haste after he saw her at a feast, an act that baffled his commanders and touched something in him that the campaign itself had not. Roxanne. She is one of the figures in Alexander's story who comes down to us as little more than a name, because the world that recorded the story was a world that did not think women's thoughts worth preserving. She was the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman. She was young when Alexander married her. She bore him a son who was born after his death and did not survive the wars that followed. What she thought of the man she married, the strange Greek king who wore Persian clothes and talked to philosophers and drove himself and everyone around him past the edge of endurance, we do not know. She was present for years of the march, and she watched it, and whatever she made of it, it went with her into the silence. The army crossed into India in the year 327. The passes of the Khyber, the rivers of the Punjab, the extraordinary fertility of the subcontinent after the dryness of Bactria and Persia. It must have seemed, to soldiers who had been marching through arid lands for years, almost unreal. The monsoon rains, which the Greeks had never experienced, came down not like the rains they knew but as a presence, a sustained, overwhelming fall of water that soaked everything and turned the roads to mud and made the men miserable in ways that the desert heat had not. They crossed the Indus. They fought. The battle at the river Hyphasis, against the Indian king Porus, who commanded war elephants in numbers the Greeks had not encountered before, was perhaps Alexander's most tactically brilliant victory, fought in monsoon darkness across a flooding river against an enemy that used the elephants the way the Macedonians used cavalry, as the weapon that could break any formation. Alexander won it. He captured Porus and, famously, restored him to his kingdom, because Porus had fought with a courage and a dignity that Alexander recognized and respected, and because respect, when Alexander chose to extend it, was genuine. Let the rain of the Punjab fall for a moment. Let it fall on the soldiers and their equipment, on the elephants that the army had now acquired and was moving eastward with the rest of the supply train, on the horses and the carts and the surgeons' tents and the workshops where the armorers kept the weapons functional through mud and rust. The men were tired. Not the ordinary tiredness of a day's march, but something deeper, the accumulated tiredness of years, of distances that no Greek had a word for, of crossing mountain ranges and deserts and rivers in numbers that the mind could no longer quite hold. They had wives and children they had not seen for 7 years. They had farms and vineyards and aging parents somewhere in the cool, pine-scented air of Macedonia that felt, by now, more like a dream than a memory. And ahead of them, always, was east. More east. The great river Ganges, which they had heard about from locals, and beyond the Ganges. What? More land. More armies. More mountains. The river Hyphasis itself, the river of the great battle with Porus, was wide and fast in the monsoon season, brown with the soil of the mountains, carrying on its surface the debris of the hills it had drained, branches and seed pods and the occasional dead animal turning in the current. The Greeks did not have a name for rivers of this size. The rivers of Macedonia were mountain streams by comparison. Even the great rivers of Persia, the Tigris, the Euphrates, were familiar in their way, flowing through landscapes that other Greek travelers had described. But the rivers of the Punjab were something else. Wide and warm and thick with life, their banks lined with stands of vegetation so dense and tall that you could not see what was behind them, full of the sound of birds whose calls had no equivalent in any Greek or Macedonian experience. The soldiers who camped on the banks listened to those calls in the evenings, and some of them must have thought about what they meant, that they were far, now, from anything that resembled home. At the river Hyphasis, one of the 5 rivers of the Punjab, now known as the Beas, Alexander's army stopped. They stopped because they refused to go on. The refusal was not a mutiny exactly. There was no violence, no deposition of the king. It was more dignified and in some ways more devastating than that. The soldiers simply sat down in their tents and would not emerge, and when Alexander called an assembly and gave a speech urging them forward, the assembly was silent, and in the silence was the answer. A general named Cenas, elderly, respected, one of the men who had been with the army from the beginning, spoke for the soldiers. He said they had done enough. He said they were not the men who had left Macedonia 8 years ago. He said they wanted to go home. He wept when he said it, and the men around him wept, and Alexander, who had never been refused anything by his army, walked back to his tent and stayed there for 3 days, waiting to see if they would change their minds. They did not. He gave the order to turn back. The decision at the Hyphasis is one of the strangest moments in the story. The moment when the human reality of the enterprise pressed through the legend and refused to be dissolved. Alexander had crossed mountains and deserts and fought armies and built a dozen cities and wanted to go further, and the army that had carried him this far simply would not carry him anymore. He built 12 great altars at the river's edge, one for each of the Olympian gods, as a monument to how far they had come, and as a marker at what was, for now, the eastern boundary of his world. And then he turned the army south, toward the mouth of the Indus, toward the ocean that he had always believed was close, the outer sea that bounded the world, which he had not yet seen and could not stop himself needing to reach. The march south through the Indus Valley was bloody. The peoples of the Punjab and Sind did not all submit, and Alexander, perhaps frustrated, perhaps driven by something darker than strategy, was not merciful in the way he had sometimes been merciful before. The Mali, a tribe who resisted, saw their city stormed and their population killed in numbers that the ancient sources record with the same equanimity with which they record the building of temples. Alexander himself was almost killed at the storming of the Mali city. He went over the wall first, as he often did, as though the thing that would have preserved an ordinary commander, which was staying behind the men he commanded, was precisely the thing he could not bring himself to do. He was shot through the chest with an arrow that penetrated his lung. His companions pulled him out of the city and brought him back to camp, and for several days it was unclear whether he would live. He lived. He always lived until he did not. The fleet that had been built on the Indus carried part of the army south while the rest marched on the banks. They reached the delta in the spring of 325, and for the first time in his life Alexander saw the Indian Ocean, that great body of water that the Greeks called the Erythraean Sea, the extension of the outer sea that bounded the world. He sailed out beyond the river mouth into the open sea and made offerings to the gods, throwing golden cups into the water, as he had seen described in old accounts of boundary crossing rituals, giving back to the ocean what it had no real need of but that the ritual required. He was 30 years old. He had walked from Macedonia to the mouth of the Indus River. He had crossed the Hindu Kush. He had entered India. He had seen the edge, or what he believed to be the edge, of the world. And now he had to get home, across a landscape that had not yet finished with him. The return through the Gadrosian Desert, now the Makran region of coastal Pakistan and Iran, was the greatest disaster of the march. Alexander chose to lead part of the army through this coastal desert, perhaps to prove it could be done, perhaps following the example of a Persian queen he had read about who was said to have attempted the same crossing. Whatever the reason, the Gadrosian Desert in summer is one of the most inhospitable environments on earth. No water, sand dunes of extraordinary height, heat that the army, after years in the field, was physically unprepared for. Men and animals died in numbers that the sources, for once, record with something approaching horror rather than the usual equanimity. Women and children who had been traveling with the army died. The pack animals died. The camp followers who had accumulated over years of march died in the sand and the heat. It was not a battle. It was an attrition, slow and merciless, and it left marks on the surviving army that no battle had left. Alexander himself survived and pressed on, and when they finally emerged from the desert into the green Persian provinces to the west, the relief was so overwhelming that the army broke into a kind of ceremonial madness, a days-long festival of drinking and music that the ancient sources describe in terms that mix admiration and unease. The last years were complicated in ways that victory had not prepared Alexander for. He was in Susa, in Persepolis, in Babylon, moving through the capitals of the empire he had won, and the administration of what he had conquered demanded a different kind of attention than the conquest itself had. He organized mass weddings at Susa. His Macedonian officers and 10,000 of his soldiers married Persian and Median women in a ceremony that was clearly Alexander's attempt to bind the two civilizations together, to make something new out of the mixing. He himself married a daughter of Darius, in addition to Roxanne, who was already his wife. His old general Hyphasis, who had been his closest companion since boyhood, died in the autumn of 324, of illness, of fever, and Alexander's grief was described by the sources as extreme, as something that crossed the boundary between grief and something harder to name, a rage at loss that had no appropriate object. He ordered mourning throughout the empire. He had Hyphasis deified. The mass weddings at Susa were followed by a further decision that his Macedonian veterans found incomprehensible. Alexander announced that 30,000 young Persian men had been trained in Macedonian fighting techniques and incorporated into the army. He called them the successors, the same name the Greeks used for young people who would carry on after their elders. His Macedonian soldiers heard this and understood it as a replacement, as a signal that they were no longer necessary, that the king who had led them across the world had found new soldiers who would not argue with him, who had not stood at the Hyphasis and refused to go further. There was a near mutiny at Opis, on the Tigris, in 324. Alexander dismissed the entire Macedonian army in a fury, announced he would campaign with his Persians alone, and retired to his palace. The standoff lasted 3 days, and then the Macedonians came to the palace and wept at the gates, and Alexander came out and wept too, and they were reconciled in the way that people are reconciled when both sides understand, finally, that the argument was never really about what they said it was about, that it was about something older and deeper. About love and pride and the particular pain of feeling replaced by something that does not fully understand what it is replacing. He was making plans. He was always making plans, and the plans after the Indian campaign were characteristically enormous. An expedition around Arabia, a circumnavigation of Africa, a return to the Mediterranean by a western route that no one had ever traveled. Whether any of these would have happened, whether the army that had stopped at the Hyphasis would have consented to further marching, is one of those historical questions to which no answer is possible. In the spring of 323, in Babylon, he fell ill. The nature of the illness has been debated ever since. Typhoid fever is the most common modern diagnosis, complicated by the wound to his lung from the Mali arrow and by the extraordinary amount that he drank. He had always drunk too much. It was one of the things his companions worried about and could not change. He grew worse over 10 days. Lying in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar beside the Euphrates, increasingly unable to speak. His soldiers came to see him, filing past his bed in the thousands, and he reportedly raised his hand to each of them as they passed, unable to do more. When they asked him to whom he left his kingdom, he said, or is said to have said, to the strongest, or to the best. The words are close in Greek, and perhaps he said both, or either, or something that dissolved into silence before it could be recorded. He died in the first days of June, 323 before the Common Era. He was 32 years old. Think for a moment about what the march felt like from the inside, not from the vantage of a king with a vision, but from the ground. A foot soldier of the phalanx, a young man from a village in the hills of Macedon, who had joined the army at 20, perhaps, lured by the promise of pay and adventure and the chance to follow a king who had never yet lost a battle. In the first years, the years in Asia Minor and Egypt and Persia, it must have been extraordinary. The heat was different from Macedonian heat, drier and more relentless, but the campaign moved quickly and the victories came cleanly and the plunder was real and the stories you would tell when you got home, the burning of Persepolis, the welcome of Egypt, the great battle at Gaugamela, were stories worth having. And then the years mounted, and the mountains came, and the rivers got wider and more numerous, and the people on the other side of them were always, another people who had not submitted, another army that needed to be fought, another campaign that would take another season, and then another, and then another. The letters home got less frequent. The faces of wives and children became harder to hold in the mind. The army was home, in the way that armies on long campaigns always become home. The familiar faces of the men in your file, the routines of camp, the language and the jokes and the shared complaints that substituted for the life you had left so far behind that you could no longer clearly remember its texture. And still Alexander pointed east. And still, until the Hyphasis, they followed. What he left behind was not an orderly succession. His generals, the Diadochi, the successors, spent the next 40 years fighting each other over the pieces of the empire, carving it into kingdoms that bore the Greek language and Greek culture deep into Asia, deep into Egypt, deep into Persia, planting a civilization wherever Alexander had marched and leaving it there to take root and grow and be transformed by the cultures it encountered. Alexandria in Egypt became one of the greatest cities and the greatest center of learning the ancient world produced. Its library, its museum, its philosophers and mathematicians and poets and physicians, all of them inheritors of the world that Alexander's march had opened. The Greek kingdoms of Bactria, in what is now Afghanistan, lasted for more than a century after Alexander's death, their coins minted with the profiles of kings who had Greek names and wore Greek dress and presided over populations that were largely Iranian and Indian, the mixture producing a culture that borrowed from all directions and was reducible to none of them. The night is very quiet now. The plateau of Persia, the Punjab plain, the desert of Jidroja, they have all stilled into the deep silence of the past, the silence that covers everything eventually, the silence under which the altars Alexander built at the Hyphasis are buried, under which the cities he founded are layered beneath later cities, under which the bones of the men who followed him are dissolved into the soil of a dozen countries. The stars above you are the same stars those men watched from their tents on the night before a battle, or on a long quiet march through a landscape so alien it had no name in the language they spoke. The stars do not change. The distances between them are so great that the light reaching you now left its source before Alexander was born, before Macedonia existed, before the Greek language had taken the shape it would take when Homer sang of Achilles. Let that light fall on you, cool and ancient and completely indifferent to the brief, flaring lives it has illuminated. What is it that draws us to this story? Not the conquest. Conquest is common enough in history, and the suffering it causes is real and must be held in the mind alongside everything else. Not the victories, or not only them. Perhaps it is the image of a person who could not stop, who looked at the world and found it insufficient to contain his curiosity, who kept walking east when every reasonable calculation said it was time to stop, who asked questions that his civilization had not yet developed the vocabulary to answer and walked toward the answers anyway. He was not a good man in any simple sense. He was capable of terrible cruelty. He burned cities. He killed men who had served him faithfully when he suspected disloyalty, or when the wine was in him, and something dangerous loosened. He was, in many respects, exactly the product of his time and his upbringing, a warrior aristocrat who had been taught that glory was the highest value and that glory required action, required movement, required the endless pressing forward against whatever the world put in front of you. But there was also in him something that the purely martial explanation does not quite cover. A genuine wonder at the strangeness of the world. A desire to know, as much as a desire to possess. his soldiers. Think of them for a moment. The ordinary foot soldiers of the phalanx, the men who were not Ptolemy or Seleucus or Perdiccas, who did not have the names that history kept. They came from the plains of Macedonia and the mountains of Thessaly and the cities of Greece, and they walked east for 11 years. They crossed the Hindu Kush in snow, and the Gadrosian desert in heat. They fought in rivers and on plains and beneath the walls of cities they had never heard of before the campaign began. They learned a few words of Persian, a few words of Bactrian, a few words of Punjabi, enough to buy food and to ask for water and to communicate the elementary facts of human need across the barrier of language. Many of them never went home. They settled where the march ended, in Bactria, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, and they married women of those places and had children who grew up speaking 2 languages and belonging to 2 worlds and being, in their own way, the real legacy of the march, not the empire, which fragmented almost immediately, but the mixing, the slow and unstoppable blending of populations and ideas and aesthetics and faiths that Alexander's passage made inevitable. Let your breathing slow now, gently. The road is very long, and you have been walking it a long time. The dust has settled. The army that raised it has passed over the horizon into the past, into the silence, into the place where all the armies and all the cities and all the ambitions eventually arrive. The stars are very bright. The air is cool and still. There is no urgency in the universe tonight, no battle tomorrow, no river to cross, no mountain pass that must be navigated before the winter closes it. There is only this quiet, spreading out in all directions from where you lie, patient as the earth is patient, waiting as the stars wait, indifferent in the way that only very ancient things are indifferent, not coldly, not cruelly, but simply because they have been here long enough to understand that everything passes and nothing needs to be hurried on its way. Alexander is buried somewhere. The location of his tomb is one of the great mysteries of ancient history. His body was taken to Egypt, eventually, by one of his generals, and a great tomb was built for it in Alexandria, and for centuries people came to see it. Julius Caesar came, and Augustus Caesar, and various emperors of Rome, paying their respects to the man whose achievement dwarfed everything that came after in sheer audacity. And then the tomb was lost, swallowed by the city, buried under centuries of new construction, its location speculated about and argued over and never definitively found. He is somewhere under Alexandria, which is now an Egyptian city of 5 million people, its streets running over the ancient layers. He is there, and he is everywhere the march went, in the archaeology and the genetics and the languages of a dozen countries, in the Greek words that wandered into Persian and Punjabi and Arabic, in the cities that still bear his name or a version of it, in the idea, which his march put into the world and which the world has never quite lost, that a person who walks far enough will eventually arrive somewhere that changes them completely. The road east is dark now. The fires of the camp have burned low, coals rather than flames, their red light barely reaching the ground beyond the circle of the camp itself. The horses are quiet. The sentinels are standing their watches in the cool dark at the camp's edge, leaning on their spears, watching the plain and the stars and thinking whatever sentinels think at the 4th hour of the night when nothing is moving. Inside the camp, 10,000 men are asleep. The sleep of people who have walked 30 kilometers in the heat and eaten and drunk and cleaned their equipment, and now lie with the particular completeness of the truly exhausted, their bodies having given everything they had to the day and now taking it back in the dark, breath by slow breath. Let your thoughts slow now, the way the camp quiets when the fires burn low. The stories you carry, the battles and the deserts and the mountains, they will still be there in the morning, patient as the stele of Aksum, patient as the altars on the Hyphasis buried under the Punjab soil. You do not need to hold them. The night will hold them for you. The darkness is deep and soft, and there is nothing in it that requires anything of you. No road that needs to be walked tonight, no river that needs to be crossed, no horizon that needs to be reached. There is only this quiet, and your breath, and the slow release that comes when the body finally lets the day go. The stars above the Punjab are the same stars above Macedonia. The same stars above Babylon, above the Gadrosian desert, above the delta of the Indus where Alexander poured his gold cups into the sea at the edge of the world. They do not know the names of the places they shine on. They do not know the names of the people who lie beneath them. They shine regardless, ancient light, traveling across distances that no human ambition can match, indifferent and beautiful and utterly, permanently present. Let them shine on you now. Let the light of things older than any kingdom and any march and any human story fall on you without asking anything in return. The stars that shone above the Hyphasis that night, the night Alexander stayed in his tent for 3 days, and the army stayed in its tents, and neither side moved, are the same stars above you now. The same Pleiades, the same Orion, the same southern constellations that had different names in Macedonian and in Persian and in Punjabi, and that were all, in every language, simply the sky, the unchanging ceiling of the world, the thing that every human being who has ever lived has looked up at from their particular position on the earth and felt, simultaneously, very small and entirely at home. You are lying under the same sky now. The world that turns beneath it is very old and very large and mostly very quiet, and the story of Alexander's march is one small bright thread in the vast tapestry of what has been attempted and suffered and lost and remembered on this planet. It is enough. It is more than enough. Let it go now, gently, the way you let go of a thread you have been following in the dark, not dropping it, just releasing your hold, trusting that it will be there in the morning. The breath slows. The muscles soften. The mind begins its descent from the bright world of history and battles and the long road east into the quieter country below, where images come and go without narrative, without urgency. A river at dusk, the shadow of a hawk on dry grass, the sound of horses breathing in the dark, the smell of campfire smoke drifting across a plain so wide and still that it seems to contain everything, all the roads and all the marches, all the sleepers who have ever laid their heads down under this sky and let the world go. Sleep now. The road has no end tonight, and that is exactly right. The world is very large and very old, and you are exactly where you need to be, and the stars are keeping their watch, and the darkness is patient. The fires burn low. The camp is still.